August 30th, 1946. Inside an interrogation room stripped of decoration, British historian B.H. Liddell Hart sat across from captured German commanders who once held the fate of Europe in their hands. His question was simple, almost academic. What would have beaten you faster? He expected technical replies about fuel shortages, Allied air superiority, industrial disparity, and strained logistics. He did not expect hesitation. He did not expect the silence that followed, and he certainly did not expect an indictment. Field Marshal General von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, adjusted in his chair, the weight of defeat hanging across his shoulders. When he finally spoke, he did not describe a weapon or a tactic. He described a moment in 1944 when Germany should have died on the battlefield but didn't. A moment when, according to him, the Allies handed the Reich a strategic gift so shocking that German commanders scarcely believed their luck. A gift that would prolong the war for months, cost tens of thousands of American lives, and change the dates carved onto headstones from autumn to spring. Liddell Hart had expected criticism of strategy. What he heard instead was regret. Regret that the guns didn't fall silent 6 months earlier. Regret that every grave dug between September 1944 and May 1945 might have been avoided. As Rundstedt spoke, Hart understood something chilling. The German High Command knew they were defeated in that autumn. Their army was broken. Their defensive spine snapped. The road to Berlin, both militarily and symbolically, was open. They were waiting for the blow that would end it all. But that blow never arrived. Late August 1944, the German army in France was not retreating in the traditional sense. It was dissolving, disintegrating under the weight of catastrophe. The Falaise Pocket had been apocalyptic. Tens of thousands of German troops captured, tens of thousands more killed, and equipment losses so severe that the roads of Normandy turned into graveyards for armored vehicles and artillery. Tanks lay abandoned with empty fuel tanks. Trucks burnt out. Guns spiked and discarded. A fighting force had evaporated into fragments. Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's notorious fireman of the Reich, arrived to salvage the Western Front. Hitler sent Model wherever disaster threatened to consume the regime, a man expected to snatch stability from chaos. What he found in France twisted his stomach. Units existed only as rumors. Soldiers without rifles wandered in clusters. Officers clutched paper rosters filled with names of men who no longer existed. The German army in the West was a mirage, something that looked formidable on a map, but dissolved upon contact with reality. Model's armored strength had been reduced to roughly 100 operational tanks, an absurd number considering the size of the front. The rest were out of fuel, broken down, or destroyed. Facing him were 12 Allied armored divisions with functioning logistics, trained crews, and overwhelming momentum. And beyond Model's shattered front lay the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, the forge that built the weapons that sustained Hitler's war. If the Ruhr fell, the Reich would suffocate. Model had no forces to stop a concentrated Allied thrust. For 3 weeks in September 1944, Germany was strategically naked. Allied intelligence knew it. Patton's Third Army knew it. And the young American soldiers racing across France could feel it in their bones. German resistance crumbled so quickly that many GIs believed they would be home by Thanksgiving. The smell of victory hung heavy in the air. For the first time since D-Day, hope had a date. They didn't know that somewhere behind them, hundreds of miles from the front, someone had already pulled the brakes. Patton reached the Moselle River, the final significant natural barrier before the Siegfried Line. His tanks sat barely 100 miles from the German border. The gates to the Rhine stood open. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, repeatedly delivered assessments so stark that even the skeptical took notice. The Germans were finished. Their army was shattered. A single concentrated blow would break them. Model, meanwhile, scavenged for manpower like a desperate man gathering scraps from a fire. He pulled elderly reservists from the Volksturm, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, clerks from offices who had never heard a rifle fired in anger. They were given barely any training, sometimes not even proper uniforms, and pushed toward the front to hold ground with courage alone. Every day that passed strengthened Model's hand. Every week rebuilt what September had destroyed. The window was closing. September 1st, 1944. Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground operations. Before him lay a choice that would determine not only how the war ended, but how long it lasted. One option: concentrate every mechanized unit, every armored column, every gallon of fuel behind a single thrust. Pick the best commander, unleash him, and carve straight into the Ruhr. High risk, high reward. If it succeeded, the war ended in weeks. If it failed, the Allies would have staked their fortunes on a single roll of the dice. The second option was slower, but politically safer. Advance on a broad front, push everywhere at once, keep the coalition balanced, squeeze Germany rather than strike it. Lower risk, lower reward. If it worked, the war ended eventually. If it failed, at least responsibility was shared. Patton wanted the first option. American doctrine supported it. German defenses could not withstand it. But Eisenhower's war was not fought only with fuel and steel. It was fought with politics. Bernard Montgomery demanded priority in the North. Churchill whispered in Roosevelt's ear, arguing for greater British influence. Montgomery threatened to bypass Eisenhower entirely and appealed to Churchill if he didn't receive fuel, ammunition, and air support. The alliance creaked. And to add more weight, Patton was politically radioactive. The slapping incidents in Sicily had made him a liability in Washington and London. Promoting him publicly, much less handing him supreme operational priority, would ignite scandal. There was also the reality of supply. Antwerp had been captured on September 4th, one of Europe's most vital deep-water ports, but it was useless. The Scheldt estuary that fed Antwerp remained in German hands. Without clearing the estuary, Antwerp could not support Allied armies. Montgomery was responsible for that clearance, but he was not focused on Antwerp. He was focused on Market Garden. Eisenhower chose the broad front, not because he was blind to the map, but because he was bound to the coalition. The price of unity was time. Patton's army rolled to a halt in early September, not because German panzers blocked the roads, but because empty fuel cans sat beside stalled Shermans. The Red Ball Express, the frantic trucking operation that ferried supplies from the Normandy beaches, choked under impossible demands. Thousands of trucks drove day and night, engines crying for mercy. But it still wasn't enough. Every army on the front was starving for fuel. And when Eisenhower was forced to choose who got the last drops, he chose Montgomery. Market Garden devoured everything: fuel, transport planes, airborne divisions. The entire Allied strategic focus pivoted toward a single audacious gambit: seize bridges across the Rhine in Holland and end the war by Christmas. Montgomery promised it. Churchill endorsed it. Eisenhower accepted it. Patton cursed it. On September 17, 1944, Market Garden began. It was the largest airborne assault in military history, and it failed with catastrophic clarity. The British 1st Airborne Division landed near Arnhem, expecting light resistance. only to meet armored units that intelligence said did not exist. Streets turned to killing zones. Paratroopers were cut down in gardens, alleys, churchyards. Of the 10,000 British troops who landed, barely 2,000 escaped. 17,000 Allied casualties were paid for a bridge too far. And while wounded paratroopers lay bleeding beside Dutch canals, Patton's tanks still waited for fuel that would never arrive. The momentum that had carried the Allies from Normandy evaporated into the foggy skies over Holland. It was the cost of choosing a shortcut to Christmas over a straight-line dash to victory. Model, watching from the German side, could scarcely believe it. Days had turned into weeks. Weeks into crucial breathing room. In early September, he had nothing. No defenses, no reserves, no coherent front. Now, by the grace of Allied caution, the situation was stabilizing. He pulled units from the interior, activated reserve formations, armed factory workers, bulldozers carved trenches, engineers repaired bunkers. Along the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, which had existed only on maps, began to reappear in concrete and steel. By late September, Model had a defensive line. By October, he had reserves. By November, he had something far more dangerous, a plan. The Allies had given him 6 weeks. 6 weeks to resurrect an army from ruin. 6 weeks that should not have existed. German generals understood why. The Allies had not concentrated their strength for a killing stroke. They had spread it thin to preserve political harmony. The broad front was a gift born not on the battlefield, but in conference rooms. The war dragged into the cold rains of autumn, then into the snows of winter. American soldiers died clearing forests that should have been bypassed. The Hurtgen Forest swallowed divisions whole. 3 months of brutal fighting for ground that, in September, had been irrelevant. 33,000 American casualties bled into the soil of a forest that did not need to be fought for, against an enemy that should have been broken 2 seasons earlier. The Siegfried Line, once a symbolic obstacle, became real again, fortified and manned. Young Americans fought bunker to bunker with Bangalore torpedoes and flamethrowers because the line had not been flanked when it was weak. The casualty lists grew longer. The telegrams continued their grim march through American neighborhoods. And in captivity, German generals told Liddell Hart that none of this needed to happen. On December 16, 1944, Germany made its last gamble. Model's rebuilt army surged through the Ardennes, smashing thin American lines that had been stretched by Eisenhower's broad front. The Germans achieved surprise. Snow fell. Radios went dead. Units vanished into the forests. The 106th Infantry Division collapsed. 7,000 Americans surrendered, more than any U.S. surrender in the European War. 80,000 casualties in 6 weeks. 19,000 dead. The Battle of the Bulge did not exist. In the universe that could have unfolded in September, it existed only because the Germans had been granted time. Time paid for with Allied hesitation and coalition politics. When the interrogations began in 1945 and into 1946, the verdict from the defeated was unanimous in a way that stunned Hart. Rundstedt, Blumentritt, von Manteuffel, Model's staff, SS Panzer commanders, regular army officers. They all said the same thing. The war could have ended in autumn 1944. One German general called the Broad Front a strategic gift. Another declared it fundamentally wrong. A captured officer told interrogators the Allies fought 2 wars, one against Germany and one against each other, and Germany only had to survive the second long enough to delay the first. And when Hart asked the final question, if a concentrated thrust was the answer, who should have led it? There was no debate. The Germans did not choose Montgomery. They respected his caution, his method, his predictability. They understood Bradley as competent but conventional. But Patton was different. His speed, his aggression, his armored thrusts, his ability to create chaos. That was the formula that frightened the German high command. Rundstedt allegedly told a Stars and Stripes reporter that Patton was your best. It was not praise, it was diagnosis. By the time snow melted and spring returned to Europe, the war ended. Germany surrendered in May 1945, but the road from September to May was paved with the names of men who might have lived. There is a difference between winning a war and ending one as fast as possible. That difference can be read in the dates on gravestones. The German generals Hart interviewed understood it. Whether Allied politicians wished to hear it was another matter. The testimonies Liddell Hart collected painted a portrait of failure not caused by lack of bravery or skill, but by hesitation and compromise. Every German general, speaking in Tabiui, measured tones behind bars, described the same lost opportunity. A decisive blow in September could have shredded the Western Front, captured the Ruhr, and brought the Reich to its knees before Hitler could react. They spoke not with malice, but with professional precision, analyzing the battlefield as if it were still 1944. There was no room for politics in their minds, only the calculation of speed, force, and timing. And in every account, the name Patton surfaced as the man who could have delivered the annihilation that coalition politics denied. September turned into October. Patton's men stared at fuel shortages, stalled trucks, and deferred orders. Tanks rested idle on roadsides, engines ticking silently in the wind while the enemy rebuilt. Model now had a semblance of structure. Trenches were dug, machine gun nests manned, anti-tank weapons positioned. The west wall, which in August had been a line on a map, became a deadly lattice of concrete, steel, and soldiers. Chung. Americans learned too late that timing is as lethal as any weapon. Every day of delay added German reserves, fortified positions, and the opportunity for the Wehrmacht to plan a counterattack. Across the Rhine, in quiet barracks and war rooms, German officers tracked the halted advance with disbelief. Their most senior generals had warned Hitler that the situation was hopeless. Yet, with each passing week, their reports began to read differently. Not as pleas for reinforcements, but as observations of opportunity. Model could now shuffle units, draw together artillery, and train the raw recruits who had been thrown into trenches without rifles. Weeks that should have ended in catastrophe were being transformed into breathing room. The Allies had given them life. By mid-October, the irony was almost cruel. The Allied broad front, meant to squeeze Germany from multiple directions, had diluted their power. Every supply train, every fuel truck, every artillery shell distributed along the front slowed the Army's ability to concentrate at a decisive point. Eisenhower, master of coalition harmony, had preserved unity, but at the cost of speed and focus. Montgomery continued to chase his ambitions in the north, his Operation Market Garden still haunting the consciousness of both commanders and soldiers alike. The Dutch bridges had not been captured. Paratroopers were still unaccounted for. Thousands of lives had been lost for a gamble that had failed. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army watched, immobile, restrained by politics and the absence of fuel. The momentum that had been theirs evaporating like morning mist over the Moselle. In Germany, Model was now reconstructing the shattered Western Front into something functional. Reinforcements arrived from quiet sectors, and as autumn darkened into November, he had more than enough to hold the line. Tanks were repaired, artillery recalibrated, soldiers trained, and officers reassembled. For the first time since D-Day, Model could see the contours of a plan: defense, counterattack, survival. The Reich had been given a second chance, a lifeline wrapped in Allied hesitation and coalition compromise. And then came December. The Ardennes offensive, the last gamble of the Reich. In a masterstroke of timing and surprise, German forces punched into the thinly held lines, catching the Allies off guard. Entire divisions surrendered. Others were annihilated before they could regroup. 80,000 American casualties, including 19,000 dead, were inflicted in just 6 weeks. The 106th Infantry Division's surrender of 7,000 men marked the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in Europe. All of this, the Germans acknowledged in captivity, was only possible because the Allies had delayed. The concentrated strike that could have ended the war in September had never arrived. The broad front had saved Germany in a way no one had anticipated. Liddell Hart pressed further in his interrogations. Who would have been the right commander to deliver the killing blow? Not Montgomery, they said. Predictable, methodical, cautious. Montgomery would never have exploited the window of opportunity in September. Not Bradley. Competent, yes, but hesitant and slow. His movements anticipated and countered by German commanders. The answer always came back to Patton. Patton's Third Army embodied the very traits the German generals feared: speed, aggression, armor concentration, relentless pursuit. He was a commander who could have destroyed them completely before they could recover. And yet, coalition politics had shackled him. The pattern was clear. Every compromise, every prioritization of political harmony over military logic had extended the war. Each decision to placate Montgomery, to allocate supplies to Market Garden, to protect the alliance, came at the cost of time. And with that, countless lives. The battles that ensued, which historians remember as victories, or failures in tactical detail, were paid for in human blood. Hürtgen Forest alone claimed 33,000 American casualties in 3 months of attritional combat that could have been avoided. The Siegfried Line, once weak and almost invisible, became formidable because the Allies did not strike when they could have. Every man who died on those frozen fields, in dense forests, and behind concrete bunkers had a name. And every death carried with it the shadow of September 1944, a missed opportunity that might have ended the war before winter. The German perspective offered something that Allied planning reports never could: clarity unclouded by politics. They understood the implications of Eisenhower's choices better than the commanders who executed them. They saw that the broad front was a political necessity, not a military strategy. They saw that coalition unity trumped momentum. They saw that a concentrated thrust in September would have torn Germany apart, and they understood exactly why it did not happen. Each captured officer expressed it differently, but the message was the same. The Allies had given Germany a second lease on life. They had postponed their own victory through hesitation and compromise. Patton, confined by bureaucratic caution, was left to watch. The Third Army, capable of tearing through Germany, languished. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks that could have rolled over weak German defenses. Supplies meant for the front were diverted to Market Garden. Patton predicted disaster, and he was right. Yet history often remembers the war as a series of victories, forgetting the moments when speed and aggression were denied, when opportunity was postponed for the sake of diplomacy. The generals in captivity made sure that Hart, and through him, history, would not forget. The winter that followed saw Germany make one final desperate attempt to regain the initiative. The Ardennes offensive struck initially with terrifying precision, exploiting weaknesses created by the Allies' cautious strategy. For weeks, American troops were battered, surrendered in mass, and killed in numbers that might have seemed unimaginable in the late summer of 1944. And yet, had the Allies concentrated in September, the offensive might never have been possible. The window had closed only because political expedience had overridden military logic. When spring arrived, Germany's defeat was inevitable, but the lessons of that autumn lingered. The broad front had preserved the coalition, yes, but it had also preserved Germany long enough for desperate countermeasures, for a bloody winter, and for the deaths of tens of thousands of young men on both sides. Allied planners who looked back focused on logistics, weather, and terrain. But the German generals looked at one variable above all: speed. Speed and decisiveness. Concentration of force. Patton had embodied these principles, and had he been unleashed in September 1944, they said, Germany would have fallen before it could regroup. Liddell Hart's notebooks filled with their words, their professional assessments, their unanimous verdict. Rundstedt, Blumentritt, von Manteuffel, and countless others told the same story. The Allies had made the right moves politically, but not the fastest moves militarily. They had kept the coalition intact, but at the cost of prolonging the war. They had avoided controversy, but created avoidable casualties. They had won eventually, but not decisively when the opportunity presented itself. And in the dry, methodical voice of German officers, the truth became undeniable. The war could have ended in autumn 1944, and it did not, because the killing blow was postponed, restrained, and politicized. Every account underscored the same point. The broad front, Eisenhower's cautious strategy, the prioritization of Market Garden, all of it had bought Germany life. Every month that passed allowed Model to rebuild the Western Front, organize reserves, and prepare one last gamble. And when the Germans launched their final desperate attack in the Ardennes, they did so not because they had strength, but because the Allies had given them the time to create it. In the end, the lessons were brutal in their simplicity. Concentrated force beats dispersed caution. Speed beats deliberation. Aggression beats hesitation. Patton, who embodied these principles, had been denied the chance to execute them. Political compromise, alliance management, and fear of scandal had prevented the Allies from ending the war months earlier. The Germans, in their captured wisdom, understood this with painful clarity. They had been given a second chance, and they used it to delay their own destruction. The Allies had won, yes, but not as quickly, not as decisively, and not without the unnecessary sacrifice of tens of thousands of lives. And Hart, recording their words, could only ask the final haunting question: was anyone listening?